The night it happened, I stood shivering on the porch, my hands pressed against the glass of a locked front door that should have been my shelter. Rain slicked the steps beneath me, and each contraction tore through my body with a force that bent me nearly double. Inside, my husband sat at our dining table laughing at something his mother had whispered, their coffee cups steaming while I struggled outside in the cold. The sound of their voices carried through the pain, muffled yet sharp enough to cut. That was the moment I understood love in my home had shifted, and I was no longer the one being protected. Before I go on, let me know in the comments where you're listening from tonight, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more true stories of family betrayal and the quiet revenge that follows. My name is Elaine Turner. I grew up in a modest home in northern Ohio, the daughter of a school teacher and a carpenter who believed in simple things, fairness, honesty, and the kind of loyalty that didn't require conditions. I carried those values with me into adulthood, convinced they would be the foundation for any life I built. When I met Daniel at a friend's wedding, he seemed to echo everything I held dear. He was steady, charming in a quiet way, and so eager to prove himself apart from the shadow of his mother's success. Within 2 years, we were married, and I thought I'd found a partner who would never let me stand outside in the storm. Our early life together looked close to perfect. We found a Victorian house on the edge of town, the kind with creaky floors and tall windows that let the morning sun in. I left my job in design to focus on preparing for the family we both said we wanted. Daniel worked long hours, but he would come home carrying takeout boxes, telling me he couldn't wait to fill the nursery with laughter. Those evenings we sat on the floor with paint samples and baby name books. I believed we were building something real. We were a team or so, I thought, but Margaret was always present, even when she wasn't in the room. She had opinions on which neighborhood was suitable, which kitchen counters were practical, which investments were safe. At first I tried to welcome her guidance. She was Daniel's mother after all, and I assumed respect was the key to harmony. Still, I noticed how decisions I thought were ours somehow ended with her fingerprints on them. The wedding venue she preferred, the house style she favored, the granite countertops I didn't want, but was told were the sensible choice. I told myself these were small compromises, not realizing they were part of a larger pattern. Pregnancy should have been a time when Daniel and I leaned on each other, learning how to become parents together. Instead, I found myself sidelined. Margaret's voice grew louder with every detail: nursery colors, doctor's appointments, even what foods I should eat. Daniel dismissed my protests, telling me his mother had experience I should value. Each time he said it, a little piece of my place in our marriage chipped away. I smiled through family dinners, laughed politely at her subtle jabs, and told myself it was temporary. But deep down, a seed of doubt was taking root. Looking back, I see the warning signs clearly. They were there in the way Daniel glanced at his phone whenever his mother texted, no matter what we were discussing. They were in the way Margaret's approval seemed to matter more than my comfort. They were in the moments I caught myself hesitating before voicing an opinion, wondering if it was even worth the argument. On the surface, we were the picture of success, a young couple in a beautiful home, awaiting their first child. But beneath it, I was already beginning to lose ground in my own life. And then, one afternoon, standing in the half-painted nursery, I realized the battle wasn't about colors or furniture. It was about control. Margaret had no intention of being a grandmother on the sidelines. She wanted to rewrite my role entirely, and Daniel was too blinded by loyalty to see it. That was the first time I felt the sharp edge of fear that I might never be allowed to be the mother, wife, or woman I had promised myself I would be. I didn't know it yet, but the cracks in our marriage were widening fast, and soon they would split open in a way that left me fighting for more than my voice. I would be fighting for my very place in my own family. I first noticed the shift in small things the kinds of moments most people would dismiss as nerves or pregnancy hormones. Margaret started arriving at our home without calling, her footsteps echoing through the hallway, as if she owned every corner of the place. She would glance at the furniture, trail a finger across a windowsill, and comment on dust that wasn't there. It was never a question, never a suggestion, always a judgment cloaked in that careful smile she wore like armor. One morning, I stood at the kitchen counter pouring Daniel's coffee into his travel mug, the smell rising warm and bitter in the quiet. I had baked blueberry muffins the night before, wanting him to have something homemade for the long day ahead. He reached for his phone before he reached for me, already lost in the rush of emails. "Mom's stopping by later," he said absently. "She has ideas for the nursery." My hand tightened around the handle of the mug. We had already chosen the color together, a pale yellow we both loved, but Margaret had decided it was too drab. I reminded him of our choice, and he gave me a distracted kiss on the forehead. "Just hear her out," he murmured, leaving me with the sound of the door closing behind him. When she arrived that morning, Margaret carried herself with the calm assurance of someone stepping onto her own stage. Her cream coat was spotless despite the damp weather, her silver hair pulled tight into a twist that showed every line of control in her face. "Darling," she said, brushing the air near my cheek in her version of a greeting. "You look tired. Are you resting enough? Stress isn't good for the baby." The words struck sharp despite the softness of her voice, a critique wrapped as concern. I guided her into the nursery, and she set down a stack of paint cards, bright pinks, heavy blues, colors so loud I could hardly look at them. I tried to explain that Daniel and I had chosen something gentle, something warm. Margaret waved her hand. "Children need energy stimulation. That yellow will wash them out before they even begin." She moved through the room with measured steps, touching the crib rails, glancing at the rocking chair that had belonged to my grandmother. "This is outdated," she declared, brushing the wood as though it might crumble. "We should replace it with something modern." Something inside me rose unshaken for the first time in weeks. "No," I said firmly. "That chair stays." She looked at me, then her blue eyes hard as steel, and smiled with a predator's patience. "You'll regret that tone, Elaine. My son values loyalty above all things. He will always stand with me." When Daniel came home that evening, I expected comfort. Instead, he paced our kitchen, his voice sharp. "She was only trying to help," he said, as if I had been ungrateful. I reminded him of the chair of the nursery we had chosen together. "So what?" he snapped. "Maybe she knows better. She's raised 3 children. You've raised none." The words hit deeper than any argument we had ever had. I pressed my hand to my stomach, feeling Grace kick inside me, restless with the tension that filled the room. "This is our baby, Daniel," I whispered. He turned away, shoulders tight, eyes fixed on the phone that buzzed with another message. "You owe her an apology," he said flatly. "Call her tonight. Make it right." The days that followed blurred into patterns that no longer felt like mine. Margaret called every morning, at the same time, her voice filling the kitchen before I had finished my tea. Daniel listened, nodding, while his breakfast cooled untouched. When she suggested I switch doctors, I refused, insisting I trusted Dr. Alvarez, who had guided me with steady reassurance from the start. "Mom knows the head of obstetrics at Presbyterian," Daniel pressed. "She can get you in." I told him I didn't want to change 7 months in, but his patient expression made me feel like a child being unreasonable. "Don't you want the best for our baby?" he asked. Margaret began arriving in the evenings, always just as we sat down to eat. She never seemed to notice the timing, walking in with urgent matters about the family business or a crisis only Daniel could resolve. Sometimes she stayed for hours, their voices carrying from the living room, while I ate dinner alone at the kitchen table. Other nights, she brought her circle of friends, elegant women with sharp eyes who studied me like an outsider. They asked if I was resting, if I was keeping the house peaceful, if I planned to redecorate. Every word polished, every smile cool, leaving me feeling like a temporary guest in my own home. Family dinners at Margaret's estate became a performance I dreaded. She sat at the head of the table, guiding conversation with questions that celebrated everyone else's accomplishments. Daniel's work successes, his sister's wedding plans, his brother's expansion in Europe. When attention shifted toward me, it was never direct. "Is she eating well?" Margaret asked, once eyes fixed on Daniel as though I were invisible. "Is she getting enough exercise?" The word she cut deeper than I expected, stripping away even the dignity of my name. On the drive home after one of those dinners, I finally found the courage to speak. "Your mother hates me," I said quietly, watching the dark road ahead. Daniel kept his hand steady on the wheel. "She doesn't hate you. She's protective." Protective of what? I asked, my voice shaking. "We've been married 3 years. We're about to have a child together. When does she let us live our life?" He sighed, his tone almost weary. "She gave up everything after my father died. She sacrificed so we could succeed. This family exists because of her. That deserves respect." His loyalty was written in every word, binding him in chains I could not cut. By the 8th month, I was a stranger inside my own life. "Doctor," Alvarez warned me my blood pressure was rising, the stress pressing down on both me and the baby. When I tried to explain this to Daniel, he folded his newspaper with calm irritation. "You're overthinking. Maybe talk to someone. Mom knows an excellent therapist." I told him I didn't need a therapist. I needed my husband to listen. He shook his head. "There are no sides, Elaine. Only family. Family sticks together." That night, as I lay awake with Grace kicking restlessly, I felt something give way inside me. I had fought for my voice, begged for my place, pleaded for Daniel to see me. Yet every word was swallowed by Margaret's shadow. And as the days shortened toward October, I understood that the battle had only just begun. The weeks that followed were measured in sighs and silences. I tried to keep my head low, hoping submission might ease the tension, but it seemed the quieter I became, the more space Margaret claimed. She had a key now, one Daniel insisted was practical, since she only wanted to help. Some mornings, I would wake to the sound of cupboard doors opening in my kitchen, Margaret already moving about as though she lived there. I would stand in the doorway in my robed stomach, heavy with Grace, pressing down and listen to her hum while she rearranged my shelves. She began orchestrating dinners gatherings that were less about family and more about reminding me where I stood. One evening, Vivian Clark, one of Margaret's closest friends, arrived with her husband. The table had been set by Margaret before I even finished cooking, her crystal glasses gleaming under the chandelier. Conversation drifted around me like smoke. They asked Daniel about his latest accounts, about his plans for expansion, about how Margaret had guided him since childhood. I waited for someone to ask me something, anything, but the moment never came. At one point, Vivian leaned across the table, her bracelets catching the light, and smiled. "You must be so proud, Margaret, to have raised such a strong son. He's carrying your legacy beautifully." Margaret's hand touched Daniel's as if sealing the praise. I lowered my gaze to my plate, the food tasteless in my mouth. Grace kicked beneath my ribs, a steady reminder that I wasn't invisible, not to her, at least. Still, each dinner felt like a performance where my role was that of a silent extra. Margaret made sure to erase me without raising her voice. She would tell a story about Daniel's childhood, laugh at her own wit, and then glance at me as though I were a placeholder rather than his wife. When I tried to speak, she had a way of cutting across, sliding into the space with another anecdote. Daniel didn't seem to notice. He laughed with them, poured wine, filled the silence Margaret left for him. And I remained on the edges, watching the bond between them tighten while mine frayed. At the hospital, Dr. Alvarez would check my blood pressure and frown. "You need rest," she warned, her hand resting gently on mine. "Stress is not your friend right now." I promised her I was trying. Though the truth was, I barely slept. At night, I would hear Margaret's words echo in my head, each one pressing like weight on my chest. She had once told me while folding baby clothes in the nursery, "Daniel will always come back to me. You may share his home, but I share his blood." She said it so calmly, I almost believed it was a fact carved into stone. After Grace was born, things did not improve. Margaret insisted on being at the hospital, hovering so close I could hardly breathe. When the nurse placed Grace in my arms for the first time, I held her tiny body against my chest, inhaling her soft warmth. But the moment lasted only seconds before Margaret reached forward, declaring that the baby should meet her grandmother. She cradled Grace with a satisfaction that pierced through me, smiling down as if she had been waiting all her life for this child to arrive. Daniel stood beside her, beaming, while I lay in the bed, hollowed by exhaustion and a sudden ache of loneliness. At home, Margaret's presence grew stronger. She dictated feeding schedules, questioned my choices of blankets, and even corrected how I rocked Grace to sleep. I would sit in the nursery late at night, humming softly, trying to claim a moment that belonged only to me and my daughter. Yet even then, I feared footsteps on the stairs, Margaret coming to remind me that I was still being watched. I began to cry in silence, tears slipping down while Grace nursed, because I didn't want to give Margaret the satisfaction of knowing she had broken me. The first time I confronted Daniel after Grace's birth, I chose my words carefully. We were in the living room, Grace finally asleep in her bassinet. "I feel erased," I told him quietly. "She makes decisions that should be ours. She takes moments that should be mine." Daniel rubbed his temples, weary from another long day. "You're exhausted, Elaine. Mom is only helping. Why do you see enemies where there are none?" I looked at him then, at the man I had trusted with my future, and realized he couldn't see the prison I was living in. To him, his mother's control was devotion. To me, it was suffocation. Evenings blurred into routines where Margaret called the shots. She arrived with lists, always lists, what Grace should eat as she grew, which schools to consider, even suggestions for tutors years before they were needed. When I protested, she smiled coolly and said I raised 3. "I know what works." Daniel nodded as though her word carried the weight of law. My silence became my only shield, though it did little to protect me. One night, after another family gathering where I had been ignored, I sat alone in the nursery. Grace's breathing was steady, her tiny fingers curled around mine. The house was quiet, except for Daniel's voice in the next room murmuring into the phone with his mother. I listened to the low hum of his agreement, the rhythm of their bond stronger than anything between us. In that moment, I realized something painful. I wasn't just losing my marriage. I was losing the right to define my own life. I tried to bury the pain, telling myself it was better to endure than to fight battles I couldn't win. But endurance wore me thin each day, carving pieces away, until I hardly recognized the woman staring back in the mirror. My eyes looked dull, my shoulders bent, my voice softer than it had ever been. Even Grace's smile, as radiant as it was, couldn't erase the ache of being unseen. It was during one of those sleepless nights that Margaret's voice replayed in my mind, sharp and certain. "He will always stand with me." I realized she wasn't wrong. Daniel had chosen his mother long before he had chosen me, and I was left holding the fragments of a promise that no longer existed. It was late September when the contractions started sharp enough to draw the air from my lungs. The nursery nightlight glowed faintly in the corner, and I sat hunched at the edge of our bed, my hand pressed against my stomach. I whispered Daniel's name, but he stirred only after the second call. When he finally sat up, I told him I thought it was time. His first words were not for me, but for his mother. "I'll call Mom," he muttered, already reaching for the phone on the nightstand. Margaret arrived 20 minutes later, her perfume arriving in the room before her presence. She looked me over with a steady eye, dismissing my pain with a clipped shake of her head. "It's too early," she said firmly. "You're exaggerating. The baby isn't ready." Each contraction felt stronger than the last. But Daniel sat at the foot of the bed, listening to his mother as if she were the doctor. "We'll wait a little longer," he told me, his tone final. By morning, the pain had doubled, radiating down my back and legs, leaving me trembling. I begged to go to the hospital, clutching the blanket as though it could ground me. Margaret stood in the doorway, arms folded, her expression calm. "Panicking won't help," she said. "Real labor doesn't come this way." I looked to Daniel, my eyes wet, but he only glanced at her before saying, "Mom thinks we should hold off." The words pressed into me like ice. At noon, I tried to walk through the living room, hoping movement would ease the strain. Margaret sat at the dining table sipping coffee while Daniel scrolled through his phone. I leaned against the doorway, a low moan escaping before I could stop it. Daniel looked up, but before he could move, Margaret's voice filled the silence. "Sit down before you wear yourself out," she ordered. When I refused, she added with a sharpness I had never heard before, "You're not in charge here." Another contraction buckled my knees and I stumbled toward the door, desperate for air. I opened it, the cool breeze hitting my face like a lifeline. I stepped out onto the porch, clutching the railing, when I heard the deadbolt slide shut behind me. I turned, disbelieving, and found myself locked out of my own home. Through the glass, I saw Daniel and Margaret still at the table, her hand on his arm, his face caught between worry and obedience. They spoke softly, their words muffled by the glass, while I stood outside in the rain, shaking from both pain and disbelief. I don't remember how long I stayed there, pacing the porch boards, leaning against the railing as waves of pain tore through me. At some point, I found the strength to stumble to the car. My hands shook as I turned the key in the ignition, the engine coughing before it came alive. I drove myself to the hospital, each stoplight stretching into eternity, my body folding over the steering wheel again and again. By the time I pulled into the emergency entrance, I was barely able to stand. Inside, the nurses moved quickly, guiding me to a room, their voices filled with concern. Dr. Alvarez arrived within minutes, her eyes widening as she examined me. "You're in active labor," she said urgently. "You should have come hours ago." I nodded, unable to form words, relief and anguish flooding me at once. For the first time in days, I felt safe, surrounded by people who believed what I was feeling. Grace arrived before dawn, her cry filling the sterile room with a sound I will never forget. I held her close, inhaling the scent of her skin, the warmth of her tiny body pressed against mine. But even that sacred moment was stolen when the door opened and Margaret walked in. She didn't knock. She didn't ask. She simply came forward, her arms outstretched, and Daniel, without a word, lifted Grace from my chest and placed her into his mother's waiting arms. The sight left me hollow. I lay there aching from labor stitches, fresh arms suddenly empty. Margaret rocked my daughter with a contentment that seemed almost triumphant, whispering words I couldn't hear. Daniel stood beside her, smiling faintly, his hand resting on her shoulder. I turned my face toward the window, tears slipping silently across the pillow. Later, when the room was quiet, Nurse Ruby came to check on me. She noticed my red eyes, the way my body trembled when I reached for Grace. She lingered longer than required, adjusting the blankets, touching my hand gently. "You're her mother," she said softly, almost as if she knew I needed reminding. "No one can take that from you." Her words settled into me, not as comfort, but as a spark. That night, as I watched Grace sleep in the bassinet beside me, I felt a clarity I had never known before. The fear, the pleading, the silent tears, they had carried me this far, but they would not carry me further. I understood then that Margaret was not content to be a grandmother. She wanted to rewrite my place entirely. If I allowed it, I would vanish from my own child's story. I stroked Grace's tiny fingers and whispered a promise. I would not vanish. Not for Margaret, not for Daniel, not for anyone who believed my silence was weakness. Something shifted inside me that night, a quiet resolve taking root where fear had lived for too long. I didn't yet know how, but I knew this one day I would reclaim everything that had been stolen from me. In the quiet weeks after Grace's birth, I learned the power of silence. It wasn't the silence of surrender anymore. It was the kind that watched, that listened, that waited. Margaret assumed she had one sweeping into our home each morning with the confidence of a queen entering her court. She held Grace as though the child belonged solely to her, whispering about how she would make sure she grew up right. I smiled when I needed to, nodded when expected, and tucked away each moment like a needle I would one day use. I began small. While Margaret spoke freely, I listened more than I ever had. She carried herself like a woman who enjoyed an audience, and in her pride, she revealed things she shouldn't. At the dining table one afternoon, while Daniel rocked Grace absently, Margaret mentioned the business partnerships she had guided in Daniel's firm, how she had advised him to take certain accounts under the table. My heart quickened, but my face remained neutral. She seemed to forget I was in the room. I tucked her words away later, writing them down in a notebook I kept hidden under the nursery dresser. When Daniel left for work, I searched the study. He had always been careless with papers, trusting that no one would dare question him. I found account statements shoved into folders, receipts that didn't line up, even correspondence from a man named Paul Jensen urging him to keep the family interests quiet. The words chilled me, but they also steadied me. Margaret's control wasn't just personal, it was financial, perhaps even criminal. The first copy I made was with trembling hands. At the library, I fed page after page into the scanner, my pulse racing with each click. Grace slept in her stroller beside me, the soft rise and fall of her chest grounding me while I copied everything I found. I stored the files on a small flash drive I bought with cash, then slipped it deep into my purse. Each time I added to it, the weight grew heavier, not just in the bag, but in my chest. I was gathering ammunition, and I knew one day I would need to use it. At night, when the house was quiet, I wrote down Margaret's words from memory. She often spoke in absolutes, bragging about the custody plan she kept drafted with her attorney, the one that would ensure Grace stayed in the Turner line should anything happen. She would smirk, sipping her wine, as Daniel looked on without protest. I waited until she left, then went to the study again, finding a folder labeled with my daughter's name. Inside were custody arrangements Margaret had written in advance, arguing that I was unfit due to stress and emotional instability. Reading those words burned me from the inside out, but they also sharpened my focus. Ruby, the nurse who had comforted me in the hospital, called to check in. Her voice was warm, grounding, and for a moment I almost confessed everything. But instead, I asked simple questions about Grace, keeping my tone light. I wasn't ready to share my plan with anyone, not yet. My revenge would require patience, and patience was something Margaret never practiced. I began saving small sums of money. Daniel handed me grocery cash without a thought, assuming I spent it all. I didn't. I clipped coupons, bought less than needed, and slipped the extra bills into an envelope tucked inside a recipe book Margaret would never touch. Each dollar was a step toward independence, a quiet defiance that gave me strength when my body still felt weak from childbirth. There were moments when doubt tried to creep in. At night, when Daniel held Grace and looked at her with soft eyes, I almost believed the man I married was still there. But then, his phone would buzz Margaret's name lighting the screen, and he would slip away without hesitation. My heart hardened a little more each time. The turning point came one evening when Margaret, glass of wine in hand, laughed about how easily Daniel deferred to her. He was always such a good boy, she told Vivian and Henry, who had joined for dinner. Even now, he doesn't make a move without my approval. Daniel chuckled along, pride in his eyes, while I stood at the sink washing dishes with my back turned. My hands shook not from anger this time, but from certainty. They underestimated me so completely they had no idea what I was building. Later that night, I sat in the nursery with Grace asleep against my chest. I looked at her tiny fingers curled into my blouse and felt something I hadn't felt in months. Control. It was fragile, yes, but it was mine. I whispered to her about the life I would give her, one where no one dictated her worth or silenced her voice. And I knew the first bricks of that future were already in place. Over the following weeks, I grew bolder. I found Margaret's journal in her purse when she left it open in the living room. She scribbled notes about meetings, about money funneled quietly into accounts abroad, about plans to ensure her legacy was untouchable. I copied page after page, my hand steady, now no longer trembling. Each secret she thought safe became another stone in the foundation of her downfall. The hardest part was the mask I had to wear. I played the obedient daughter-in-law, the tired but grateful wife, the quiet mother who deferred to their wisdom. I smiled at the dinners, laughed when expected, and allowed Margaret to believe she was shaping my life. Inside, I was mapping her empire, learning where the cracks had already begun to form. I started keeping my phone on silent, recording conversations when she grew careless. Her voice filled the files with damning phrases. "He doesn't need to know the numbers. She won't last long in this house. Grace will be ours." Each sentence was a rope, and I was quietly braiding them into the noose she had tied for herself. The day came when I looked at Daniel across the table and no longer felt fear of losing him. What I felt instead was a quiet distance, a certainty that he was no longer my partner, but Margaret's shadow. That realization freed me. My plan was no longer about saving my marriage. It was about saving myself and Grace. One evening, as I tucked Grace into her crib, I heard Margaret downstairs, her laughter carrying through the house. Daniel's voice joined hers, low and steady, their bond as strong as ever. I closed the nursery door gently and pressed my back against it. My hand touched the flash drive hidden in my pocket, the envelope of bills growing heavier in the recipe book, and the notebook of her words tucked under the dresser. For the first time, I didn't feel powerless. By the time Grace was 3 months old, my silence had become sharper than any words I could have spoken. Margaret mistook it for surrender. Daniel mistook it for fatigue. But inside, I was calculating. Each smile I offered, each nod I gave, was another layer of disguise, while I pieced together the map of their empire. They believed I was still under their thumb, yet I was already 3 steps ahead. I had gathered enough papers to fill a drawer, but I needed more than scraps of evidence. One afternoon, I drove across town under the pretense of grocery shopping. Grace slept in her car seat, her soft breaths steady, while I walked into the office of Richard Hale. He had been recommended quietly by a neighbor, a man known for discretion and sharp instincts. When I sat across from him, clutching the folder to my chest, he studied me without judgment. I spread out copies of Margaret's journal entries, business statements, and custody drafts across his desk. His eyes moved slowly, his brow furrowing. "This is serious," he said finally. "If what you're showing me is connected, it's more than family meddling. It's fraud, possibly conspiracy." I swallowed my hands, trembling. "I don't want money. I just want my daughter safe, and I want my life back." Richard nodded, pushing the papers into a neat stack. "Then you'll need to be patient. We build a case quietly, and when it's ready, it will be undeniable." His calm steadied me. I left his office that day lighter than I had felt in months, the flash drive warm in my purse like a secret weapon. At home, the charade continued. Margaret still arrived unannounced, still rearranged drawers, still dictated how Grace should be held. I let her. The more she believed she had control, the less she watched me. Daniel was no different. His late nights grew more frequent, his phone always buzzing with messages he never explained. When I asked, he brushed me off. "Business, Elaine. Don't make it a problem." His distance stung, but I welcomed it. The less he looked at me, the more room I had to maneuver. One evening, while Margaret and Daniel spoke in the study, I sat in the nursery rocking Grace. Their voices carried through the walls low but clear enough. "She's fragile," Margaret was saying. "If we push the custody petition soon, the court will see she isn't stable." My blood ran cold, but I forced myself to stay still, my hand gently patting Grace's back, as if nothing had changed. Later, when the house quieted, I added their words to my notebook. Another nail in the coffin Margaret was building for herself. Richard and I spoke in hushed calls when Daniel was at work. I gave him updates, and he gave me instructions. "Don't confront them," he reminded me. "Let them talk. Let them believe you're defeated. Every careless word is another piece of evidence." His advice became my mantra. Each time Margaret boasted, I leaned in as though listening with admiration, when in truth I was memorizing every phrase. The tension reached a breaking point at a dinner party Margaret hosted for Daniel's colleagues. The dining room glittered with candlelight glasses filled with expensive wine, and Margaret presided at the head as though she were queen. Paul Jensen, seated beside her, raised a toast to the woman who kept the Turner family legacy intact. Laughter rippled around the table, but I felt the weight of his words. Margaret lifted her glass, smiling as she replied, "Family loyalty is everything. Without it, we'd be nothing." She glanced at me as she spoke a warning, hidden behind her polished grin. I smiled back a mask, covering the storm inside me. Later that night, while cleaning the kitchen, I found Paul's briefcase left near the door. My heart pounded as I quietly unlatched it. Inside were documents marked with Margaret's initials, outlines of accounts and transfers, all confirming what I already suspected. I took pictures quickly, my hand steady before snapping it shut again. The next morning, those images were in Richard's hands, his voice taut with certainty. "This will break them," he said. What surprised me most was how Margaret's arrogance became her undoing. She grew careless, emboldened by my silence. At brunch with her friends, she spoke freely about the arrangements she had made for Grace's future. Vivian asked whether Daniel approved, and Margaret laughed. "Daniel doesn't question me. He never has. Elaine will be out of the picture soon enough." I sipped my tea, eyes lowered, letting the words settle like poison I planned to distill later. Daniel remained blind. He accused me of being withdrawn, distant, ungrateful for his mother's help. "She's the only reason we're standing," he said during one argument, his voice sharp. I stared at him, realizing he had no idea the ground beneath him was already crumbling. He believed Margaret's strength was unshakable, never suspecting the walls were closing in. By the start of winter, my case was nearly complete. Richard assured me we had enough documents, recordings, testimony from those Margaret had wronged. "When we move," he said, "it will be swift. She won't have time to recover." His words were the first taste of justice I had allowed myself to imagine. At night, I stood at the window of the nursery watching snow fall against the dark glass while Grace slept in her crib. I held the notebook close, the flash drive tucked safely away. and felt the weight of what I had built. My fear had transformed into something steadier, harder. I was no longer just surviving. I was preparing for war. The storm broke on a cold Saturday in early spring, the kind of day when the air carried a damp weight that never lifted. Margaret had arranged a gathering at her home to celebrate Daniel's new partnership, though it was clear the event was more about displaying her influence than honoring his achievements. The dining hall glittered with polished silver and heavy chandeliers, every detail carefully curated to remind her guests of the empire she believed unshakable. I walked in with Grace in my arms, dressed in soft pink, her little head nestled against my shoulder. I kept my steps even, my face calm, though my pulse beat like a drum. Richard had warned me once the first strike landed, there would be no turning back. The night before, I had signed the final documents, divorce papers, custody petitions, and a packet of financial evidence that painted Margaret not as a matriarch, but as the architect of fraud. While Daniel and his mother mingled greeting guests with smiles that didn't quite reach their eyes, I slipped quietly into the background, waiting. The first blow came before dessert was served. Men in dark suits entered through the wide double doors, federal agents whose presence brought a hush over the room. Their voices were low but firm as they announced they had warrants. Conversations stilled, glasses froze midair, and Margaret rose from her chair, her face tightening. "This is a mistake," she declared, her voice still carrying authority. But when the agents laid the papers before her, the color drained from her cheeks. Daniel tried to speak, demanding answers, but his voice was swallowed by the rustle of papers and the flashing of badges. I stood near the corner, holding Grace, my heart steady for the first time in months. The evidence I had collected, the journals, the recordings, the transfers, had all been traced and confirmed. Margaret's empire wasn't untouchable anymore. It was crumbling right there in front of her guests, the same people she had so proudly entertained. Paul Jensen slipped out the side door before the agents could stop him, but it didn't matter. His name was all over the documents Richard had filed. Margaret's friends sat stiffly, avoiding her gaze, while Vivian whispered something sharp to Henry and excused herself in a hurry. The room that once echoed with her laughter now pressed in with silence, suffocating and unforgiving. Margaret's arrest was quiet. She didn't fight as they guided her toward the door, though her eyes found mine across the room. For the first time, there was no smugness in her stare, only shock and the faintest trace of disbelief. Daniel turned to me, then his face pale, his voice low. "What did you do?" he asked, as though he still couldn't understand. I met his gaze, my daughter's breath warm against my neck, and said nothing. Some answers didn't need words. The fallout was swift. By Monday morning, headlines splashed across newspapers and local broadcasts, exposing fraudulent dealings tied to Margaret's companies and her manipulation of Daniel's firm. Clients withdrew. Accounts were frozen. By the end of the week, the Turner name was no longer a symbol of strength, but a warning of greed and corruption. Daniel spent hours on the phone, his voice breaking as he tried to salvage what couldn't be saved. At night, he sat in the darkened living room, staring at nothing while I rocked Grace upstairs. I filed my own papers that same week. The custody petition included every word Margaret had written about me, every conversation I had recorded, every plan she had crafted to strip me from my daughter. Richard filed it with precision, his tone unwavering as he assured me, "They won't touch her now. You've secured your place." Daniel received the divorce filing 2 days later. He didn't shout. He didn't plead. He only stared at the papers, his face blank, his hands slack. "You've destroyed everything," he said, softly, almost to himself. I looked at him, the man I once loved, and felt no triumph, only the weight of truth. I hadn't destroyed anything. I had only uncovered what was already rotten. Margaret's world collapsed in slow motion after that. Her estate was seized, Her accounts audited her influence, stripped piece by piece. Friends who once filled her table vanished, unwilling to be tied to scandal. Even Vivian, her most loyal companion, stopped returning her calls. Daniel was questioned repeatedly, though much of the evidence pointed to Margaret as the mastermind. Still, his reputation suffered, and his career built under her shadow unraveled with hers. I moved quietly through it all, keeping Grace shielded from the storm. I attended the hearings with Richard by my side, never sitting close enough for Margaret to reach me with her gaze. She appeared smaller each time her shoulders stooped, her voice less certain. She still tried to command the room, but no one listened anymore. At home, I began to reclaim space that had once felt foreign. The nursery became ours again, filled with laughter instead of whispers of control. I cooked in my own kitchen without Margaret rearranging the shelves, and for the first time, silence felt like peace instead of prison. One night, as I rocked Grace to sleep, Daniel stood in the doorway, his face drawn with regret. "I didn't see it," he whispered. "I thought she was protecting us." I didn't answer. Some wounds ran too deep for words. He left quietly, and I knew then our lives had already parted for good. The weeks that followed were quieter than I had imagined. The noise of courtrooms, lawyers, and headlines faded into something softer, just me, Grace, and the sound of her steady breathing at night. Margaret was behind bars. Daniel was gone from our home, and the weight that had pressed against my chest for so long finally lifted. For the first time in months, I could walk through my house without feeling like a guest in someone else's life. I found strength in the simplest routines. Morning light pouring into the kitchen as I brewed coffee. Grace's small hand curling around my finger. Even the silence, once so heavy, became a kind of music. Friends who had watched from a distance began to visit again, bringing meals, holding Grace, and reminding me that I had never been as alone as Margaret wanted me to believe. Daniel tried for a time to reach me. There were letters, calls, moments where he asked for another chance. But the marriage we had was gone, hollowed out by years of his silence and his mother's dominance. I wished him no harm, yet I knew I could never build a future with a man who had turned away when I needed him most. Margaret's empire never recovered. The woman who once ruled every conversation now sat in a cell, her name tied forever to greed and deception. I did not celebrate her fall. I didn't need to. Justice is quieter than revenge. It doesn't roar. It settles like dust after a long storm. She had taken so much from me, but she had not taken my dignity. That was mine to protect, and I had reclaimed it. There were nights I sat by Grace's crib and thought about everything we had endured. The locked door, the cold porch, the laughter behind the glass. I thought about the weight of silence and how it nearly crushed me until I learned to turn it into strength. Pain had shaped me, yes, but it had not defined me. What defined me was the promise I kept to myself that my daughter would grow up knowing her mother stood firm. Life now feels different, not perfect, but real. My days are built on honesty, not performance. I don't need to fight for space in my own home anymore. I don't need to silence my thoughts to keep the peace. Grace will grow up seeing a mother who chose resilience over despair, dignity over humiliation, truth over comfort. And that is the legacy I want for her. If there is a lesson in all of this, it is that quiet strength is not weakness. Sometimes it takes silence to gather courage, patience to prepare, and resolve to act when the moment arrives. Justice may not erase the past, but it restores what matters most, our right to stand tall in our own lives. Before we close, I'd love to know what part of this journey spoke most to you. Share your thoughts in the comments. And if you'd like to hear more true family stories, stay connected here.